Hey beautiful people, what is up and welcome back to my channel. I am Jamila and I love all things beauty. I love all things makeup, I love all things skincare, and I especially love sharing my tips and tricks for how to find high-end and luxury beauty products at bargain prices. If that sounds like something you're interested in, I would absolutely love if you would consider subscribing and joining the family. Alright, so even though I love all things beauty, I also love all things true crime, so I'm just going to be doing another makeup and murder episode. I think this is episode 3. So we're just gonna dive in. I'm getting ready for work, so I'm just gonna do my makeup while I get ready. And this story is, whew, child. I got my coffee. The eyeshadow palette of choice for this morning is gonna be the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette. This is in the deep shade. Look at that. So freaking beautiful. Absolutely stunning. This was gifted to me by the brand, so I'm really excited to play in this. This has been on my wish list for a very long time. This is not a new palette, y'all. This has been out for a minute and a half, but I really want to play in this palette because for today's makeup and mood, I'm going to be talking about the Netflix series. Because for today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Netflix series, The Staircase. That series has stressed me out. So very much. Okay, so I'm gonna go in with the shade Juliet first as a transition shade. Okay, so The Staircase. So I actually ended up watching The Staircase, I want to say about 2 weeks ago now. And I watched the entire thing in one full sitting. I do not recommend that you watch it in one full sitting. I think it's about 13 episodes. Each episode is about an hour long, and it's a lot. It's a lot. My fiance and I, we literally sat down and spent an entire day binging that full series. So I can tell you that it is a lot to go through. And I definitely recommend you piece it out, you know? Do a couple of episodes every day or something like that. So basically, The Staircase tells the story of Michael Peterson, who was an American novelist that was charged and convicted of the murder of his wife, Kathleen. And what I thought was really interesting about the series is that you get this abnormal, and by abnormal I mean it's so rare to get this first person perspective of his entire ordeal. I don't know why he thought he needed to film this, but he basically films his entire sort of experience with the American justice system from the minute he was charged up until the end of the story, which I'm not gonna spoil for you guys. So, which is 15 years later. So this is 15 years of him filming, you know, his engagement with the American justice system. Everything from going to court, being arrested, appeals, the whole shebang. So the series actually starts with Mike at his home, and what is interesting about how the series progresses is that you really see how everything changes as the time goes on. Like I said, this was over 15 years, so you get like that old grainy footage from not the best cameras from back in the day, and you can see how he ages and how his family ages across time. So this, like I said, the series starts with him, you know, at the house where his wife died. And what we basically find out is that Mike was outside in the family pool, or by the family pool, and he goes into the house and he finds his wife, Kathleen, dead at the bottom of the stairs. So he calls 911, and we're able to hear that 911 call because, you know, all 911 calls are recorded. And, you know, he sounds quite distraught. You know, he's telling the 911 operator his wife fell down the stairs. There's a lot of blood, blah, blah, blah. So the police show up, and they immediately don't think that this is a she fell down the stairs situation, because she is covered in blood. The staircase has a ton of blood on it. It just didn't seem like a fall from a staircase. It just didn't seem to make any sense. So ultimately, Mike is charged with the murder of his wife. And once he's charged, then we go through the bulk of the series, which is really kind of following him through the trial and the pre-trial stuff. So we end up meeting Mike's attorney. His name is David Rudolph. And my first thought when I saw him was like, oh, so this is what money can get you. in terms of a good lawyer. And you see that throughout, the progression of the case, David is quite a good lawyer. He spends a lot of time sort of following the evidence, figuring out what makes sense, what is logical, and what is not logical. You also see that as a part of his defense team, they work with forensic scientists that could analyze blood splatter and all of this stuff. Because like I said, when she fell down the stairs, she was covered in blood. The staircase was covered in blood. So it kind of was a little bit suspicious. And to be honest, when I first started this, I was like, okay, he definitely did it. I've watched enough true crime shows to know that when it comes to cases where someone ends up dead, it's usually, it's one of two things. It's either the last person that saw them alive or somebody very close to them. And in this case, Mike was both. Mike was Kathleen's husband and also the last person to have seen her alive because he was the only other person that was at the house. So I was like, okay, he definitely did it, because when you looked at the crime scene photos, which they actually showed, and I was quite surprised by the fact that they did and wish they didn't, to be honest. She had 7 lacerations on the back of her head, and she was wearing these gray sweats at the time, and these gray sweatpants with like a blue sweater, and her sweatpants were absolutely covered in blood, and there was blood spatter on the wall where she supposedly hit it. So, the police, and even myself from watching that, I was like, I feel like I've watched a ton of movies where when people fall on the stairs, you might hit your head and you'll have just one point of impact, or you break your neck or something like that, right? And because she had 7 lacerations, to me, I was like, how much time, did she get up and fall 12 different times? Because it didn't make much sense to me. And the police thought the same thing. They were like, she can't have fallen that much. And we come to find out that, at the point of Kathleen's death, she had I think it's like a 0.7 blood alcohol level, which I think is double the legal limit. So she was, I think, legally drunk, and she had Valium in her system. So, Mike's sort of defense was that she was drunk, she was on Valium, and she fell down the stairs and she hit her head. And the experts that they brought in to look at the blood spatter were basically trying to say that, okay, she fell down the stairs, she hit her head, that first point of impact, started bleeding, and then she tried to get up, and every time she tried to get up, she hit her head again, hence the multiple lacerations. I was side-eyeing that theory so hard because to me, that didn't seem to make a ton of sense. And one of the questions that came about was, well, okay, if she fell down the stairs, she must have cried out. She must have been like, help me, help me. So they actually recreated an experiment where they had these giant speakers at the bottom of the stairs. Mike was outside, again, by the pool, and they were playing these speakers of like a woman screaming for help. And it was very clear that if you were outside, you would not hear it. One, because it's a very, very large house. They were a pretty wealthy family at the time. And 2, there was also this fountain outside, and if you've been near a fountain, you know that those things can be quite loud. So, they had the speaker going inside, and Mike and a couple other folks were outside. So they kind of proved, okay, if you were really outside and somebody was inside the house screaming for help, it is completely possible that you would not hear them. So, Mike's defense is his wife fell down the stairs. He was outside. He didn't hear her screaming for help or anything. And then by the time he got inside, he called 911. So while Mike and his lawyers are preparing for this case and his trial, we get the first bombshell in the story, which was basically that this was not the first time a woman had fallen down the stairs in Mike's life and died. So, and I agree. My first reaction was like, okay, he did it. That is suspicious as hell. Nobody could be that unfortunate where you've had 2 women in your life fall down the stairs and die. So for a little bit of backstory, Kathleen is actually Mike's second wife. Mike and his first wife actually used to live in Germany. And I believe he was in the army or something like that. And one of his best friends' widow is the one who actually fell down the stairs. So they used to live, pretty close to each other. And the thing too about it was that he was the last person to see that woman alive. So it came out looking real suspicious. But basically, his best friend's widow ended up falling down the stairs, and I don't think he found her, but when they eventually found her, her death was ruled as accidental. And what was interesting about that is that Mike actually went on to adopt that woman's 2 daughters, and they became his daughters at the time. So it raised a lot of questions, right? Did he kill her? If he did, why would he adopt her 2 daughters? That's a big responsibility to take on. And actually, between Kathleen and Mike had 2 sons from his previous marriage. Kathleen had a daughter, I think, from a previous marriage or relationship. And then they both adopted these 2 little girls from Germany. So that was kind of like the first bombshell in this case, was that, okay, this had happened to him before. This is not the first time a woman has died in the exact same method of falling down the stairs in front of him. And what I thought was interesting and a little bit sad was the fact that the judge actually allowed this to be a part of his trial as sort of like, I don't know, evidence for the prosecution that this has happened before. He's done this before, even though there was nothing to indicate that he was responsible for that woman's death. And her death had been ruled an accident, so they actually went so far as to have her body exhumed to re-examine it to figure out, was it really accidental? And they actually got the accidental, they actually got the cause of death to be changed from accidental to homicide. So I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, so I'm going to leave the eyes like this for now and go into the face. So like I said, the judge decides that the prosecution can raise the issue of the death of this woman. I think her name was Elizabeth Radcliffe. In this trial, as I don't even know what kind of evidence it would be, but it kind of seemed, in my opinion, like they were accusing him of killing that woman as well, even though that case had already been closed and been ruled an accident. And going back to my point of, or my earlier thought about what money can buy you in terms of a defense, in the series we actually see Mike's lawyers, what's his name, David Rudolph and company, I don't know who the rest were, they actually went to Germany to physically look at the home of Elizabeth Radcliffe, to see the staircase that she fell down, to better understand those circumstances. And they spoke to, the people that lived in the community to understand what had happened, including his ex-wife, who I still believe lived there. So I'm going in with a new foundation. This is the Too Faced Born This Way matte version. This is in the shade Chestnut. I picked this up during one of these sales where it was like 40% off. So hopefully this works. And this is my shade. Had Mike been a regular guy, with a regular public defender or whatever the case is, they would not have been flying to Germany to get evidence of his innocence in that other case. Like, absolutely not. And then the second bombshell that we get in this like pre-trial phase, when they're all kind of like gathering evidence to either help prosecute him or help defend him, is that we find out that Mike is bisexual. And apparently nobody knew this. So, this was in 2001. That's when his wife died, December 2001. So this was in the early days of the internet, back before, people really understood how, your online presence could follow you everywhere and really affect you. And they were able to discover some online messages between Mike and this male escort, Brian. And that is when the prosecution really started with their argument of, okay, now we understand why he killed her. Because for me, the whole time I was watching the series and they were like, okay, he killed her, he did it, I was like, okay, but why? I didn't understand what was the reason for him killing her. They seem to be a quite well-off family. It's not like he was killing her for money, in my opinion. So what was the motive? So once the prosecution discovered that he was bisexual and he was living this underground life where he would frequently either reach out to or try to connect with male escorts, they decided that his motive for killing Kathleen was that she found out that he was gay, and they kept calling him gay for some reason. She found out that he was gay / bisexual, and she would never have accepted that, and in a fit of rage, he threw her down the stairs. And in a fit of rage, he beat her to death with a blowpoke. I had to Google what a blowpoke was because I was like, what? And if I find it, I'll insert a picture. But that was the argument from the prosecution. That was that was the story that they came up with once the second thing kind of like blew up, where it was, okay, he was bisexual, Kathleen would have never accepted that, so he killed her because of that. And it was a mess. So okay, this foundation is a little bit more orange than I would like it to be, but we gonna rock with it. For concealer, I'm gonna go in with my LYS concealer. I picked it up in a new shade. This is DG6. I also picked it up in DG3, but I'm also gonna go in with a little bit of my e.l.f. Camo concealer in the shade Deep Olive, and use that in the very inner part because it's quite bright. So again, the judge decides that the evidence of Mike's sexual orientation is permissible in this trial, which I was like, okay, it doesn't seem at all relevant to this case, but the entire prosecution's argument is based on the fact of this man's sexuality, because there was no evidence to say that he pushed her down the stairs, none whatsoever. But there was also no evidence to say that he didn't. Like, the evidence was extremely strange. Like, I personally found it quite confusing, the amount of blood that was on the staircase on Kathleen's body from a basic fall down the stairs. But I also could not come to terms with, why would he beat her to death? It didn't seem like he had any reason to. And the argument that they were making where he beat her to death with this blowpoke that they suddenly couldn't find, it just wasn't adding up. And once the information about about Mike's sexuality came out, I think that this is when we saw a real shift in the energy. And I think it was evident at the time that there was a lot of homophobia, a lot of like individualized bias about his like sexual orientation. You know, Mike made it very clear when he was discussing it with his team that, you know, Kathleen knew about his sexuality and she accepted it. But it was quite clear that no one else in his family knew about his sexual orientation. And remember, I talked about the fact that they had, you know, Mike had 2 kids from a previous marriage. Kathleen had a daughter, and then they adopted these 2 girls. At the beginning, Kathleen's daughter was like, you know, the main spokesperson for the family, and she was very much like, okay, Mike would never do this, that's my dad, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like once the information about his sexual orientation came out, it became a, okay, he definitely killed her kind of situation. And she completely changed sides. And it ended up being that Kathleen's daughter and Kathleen's sisters were very much like, he murdered our sister, he murdered my mother. And it was a very, very clear divide. When at the very beginning of this, they were all quite adamant of, you know, he would never do this. You know, in the documentary, you get little clips of them saying, you know, we thought we knew him, but clearly we did not know him at all. And that was because of the fact that they didn't understand how he had been hiding his sexual orientation, and they believed that Kathleen would not have accepted it. Mind you, they're not in their marriage, so they can't say what she would or would never accepted, but that is where they were. So as we're approaching the trial, one of the, again, interesting things about What Money Gets You is that we actually see David, Mike's lawyer, have these almost like mock jury trials. And you would see, I don't know if you've ever seen the series Bull, but Bull is about this jury specialist, and they specialize in, you know, helping to pick juries so that it can sway the case one way or the other. Because, you know, while there are facts to a case, people are emotional beings. So you try to find a jury that could relate to your situation, a jury that's not going to judge you on certain things. And what I thought was interesting is that they brought in all of these people. I don't know where they found them, but they brought in all of these people, and they had almost kind of like mock trials where they would present specific evidence to them to get their reaction. And one of the pieces that they brought up was the, to these jury folk, was the woman dying in Germany, the other woman that fell down the stairs. And they definitely felt like it was suspicious. They was like, that doesn't make much sense. Like, no one could be that unlucky to have two women die in the exact same way around them. And I completely agree with them there. But then there was the other piece to it, too, where they were like, well, yeah, that other woman died, but at the end of the day, he adopted her two daughters, which I don't think anybody would do if they had just killed that woman. So they were kind of torn on that, where it was like, okay, you can't really be that lucky, but also, would you have adopted her kids? So that was interesting. And then they had the mock jury analyze their blood spatter analyst. And that, I hated that episode, because they spent so much time trashing that man, not for his expertise, but because he had an accent and they couldn't understand him. He was speaking English. So he was an Asian American guy. He obviously had a very heavy accent, but it wasn't an accent that was so heavy that you could understand what he was saying. Don't get me wrong, there were parts of his like testimony where he got really technical, and it was like, you know, break that down into English for me. But it felt like they took away some of his credibility because they couldn't understand him. They didn't know what he was saying. They couldn't relate to him, which I thought was a little bit unfortunate, because clearly he knew what he was talking about. Anyways, so the trial is fast approaching, and everybody knows, or, you know, Mike's defense knows that the Germany case does not look good for him, and the sexual orientation thing also doesn't look good for him. And they basically kind of like lost their bid to keep that out of the trial with the judge, unfortunately. So the trial starts, and the prosecution is pushing this theory of two theories. One, Mike's sexual orientation and Kathleen not being receptive to it, and that being his motive for killing her. But then also, two, he's done this before in Germany. They bring a number of witnesses to the stand. So first, they bring Brian, who is the male escort that Mike had been talking to. And that was a real interesting testimony, because even though, you know, he came and he was very much like, yes, he was looking to meet up with me to have sex, blah, 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 he also at the same time said, you know, he seemed to have a real happy marriage. Like, it didn't seem like there were any issues. Like, I didn't get the sense that this guy who was in some ways cheating on his wife was unhappy. And all in all, I felt like that was completely irrelevant. I felt like it had no relevance to the case. Like, there was really no point in him being up there testifying. But that's what he did. He went up there and he testified. And then the prosecution also had their SBI analyst, which is basically their crime scene analyst. You know, like, think CSI, the people that come and they look at the blood splatter and they look at the DNA, blah, blah, blah. They had him testify. And he spent a lot of time sort of basically trying to prove that the blood splatter that were on the walls and on Mike's clothing and everything could only be because of him beating her to death. It could not have been from a fall down the stairs. And the prosecution really pushed that he beat her to death with this blowpoke. Now, the blowpoke was a gift that Kathleen's sister gave the family years ago, and it had been missing. Nobody could find this blowpoke, but the prosecution was like, okay, this is what he used to kill her. And then, lo and behold, we're coming to the end of the case, and the blowpoke is found. Boom. The blowpoke had been in the garage somewhere for a very, very long time. It was covered in cobwebs and spiders and dust and all kind of thing. So they bring the blowpoke into court. They, present it before the jury and everything. And they're basically saying, and by they I mean the defense, they're basically saying, you guys said that he beat her to death with the family blowpoke. This is the blowpoke. There's no blood. There's nothing. There's no evidence on here to show that he beat her to death with this blowpoke, which you have based your entire argument on. And we found the blowpoke, and it's completely clean. So the defense is like, okay, smoking gun. We found the blowpoke. Obviously, we need, there's no evidence on here that says that she was beaten to death with this. So there you go. Case closed. But of course, nothing is ever that simple. So all in all, the jury finds him guilty of murder, and he is sentenced to life in prison, I believe, without the possibility of parole. And you think that's where the story ends, but no. It keeps going. Fast forward 8 years later, we see this man coming out of prison, and I was like, okay, who is this? Come to find out that this is actually a man who was convicted, I believe, of murder, and it turned out to be that he was innocent. And what had happened was the SBI analyst, Dwayne Deaver, who was the same analyst from Mike's case, had basically been doing bad science. He had been faking test results. He had been faking experiments, making up experiments that didn't make any sense, just to prove the prosecution's case. So he had like 30 or 35 cases, 34 to 35 cases, where he had just made up experiments, made up test results, gotten rid of negative test results, just so that the prosecution could win their cases. And ultimately, this man ended up getting freed because they found this out. He ended up being fired in the long run, but we see him getting out of prison, and then we see Mike's lawyers and his daughters meeting up, and they're like, okay, well, if he did this to this other guy, this is our chance to appeal again. Because at this point, Mike had been in prison for 8 years. He'd lost all of his appeals. It was kind of like they'd done everything they could do. For highlighter, I'm going to go in with the Anastasia Iced Out highlighter. It looks really white, but it's a really pretty gold. So yeah, fast forward 8 years later, and we see his lawyers and his daughters meeting. Now, this was like really, really interesting because it's like it was such a shift because, 8 years later, everybody looks completely different. The camera quality has changed. Everything has changed. It's been almost a decade. And then we see Mike in prison, and this man just looks beaten down. He's been in prison all this time because he was convicted and all of his appeals were lost. And he just looks like, all the happiness and the joy has been sucked out of him. So now that this guy has gotten out of prison because Dwayne Deaver has basically been, faking test results and putting people away unjustly, they take the case back to the judge to see if they could get a retrial because of that. Ultimately, the retrial was granted, and then we see Mike get released. I think he was released on bond until the new trial started. Okay, I'm going to finish up the rest of my face really quickly with some line and some mascara, and then I'll come back and finish up the video. Okay, so this is the final face. Oh, sorry for the sunlight, but yeah. So to wrap things up, Mike is granted a new trial, and he's able to get out of prison while he waits for that new trial. And, like I said, you could see the 10 years, or I think it was 8, the 8 years of just struggle, 8 to 10, you could just see how that 8 years had taken a toll on him. Like, he looked like he aged 20 years. His health was clearly not at its best. He looked broken down. And you could see that he was trying to keep himself in good spirits. There was actually a scene kind of like prior to him being awarded a new trial where he was in prison and one of his sons brought his little baby to see him. And he was trying to joke and be like, oh, baby's first visit to prison. But you could clearly see that it bothered him that, you know, he was here. He couldn't touch the baby. He was behind like the glass and everything. And it was just really, really sad. So he gets out of prison. He's able to touch his family. He's able to hug his family. And it's just a really nice like reunion. But there's this thing looming in the background because now he has to go through this trial all over again. A trial that was very taxing on him the first time. And, you know, part of that is because they put all of his business out there and he never got a chance to mourn his wife. Like, you could still see that he's still very sad about the death of his wife because he's never had a chance to mourn her. The minute she died, he was accused of murder and then he was going through this trial. So, like, and then to have all of your public business about your sexual orientation, about your life in a whole different country, just put on blast when it has nothing to do with what happened is just really unfortunate in every way possible. So, you know, while he's preparing for his new trial, at one point his original lawyer, Mike, quits. You know, part of it being that the money had run out. You know, when they started this, he was obviously very affluent person, but now 8 years has passed. He doesn't have the resources anymore. They don't have the big house and the money's gone, right? So his lawyer actually quits, but then he comes back in the end and they're having this conversation of, do we do this again? Do we go through an entirely new trial? We don't know how it's gonna go. We don't know what's gonna happen. We don't know if we're doing all of this for you to just go back to prison. How about we take a plea? Ultimately, he does take an Alford plea, which is not a guilty plea, but it basically says that the prosecution has enough evidence for either a judge or a jury to likely find you guilty. And because of that, you are not saying that you're guilty, but you're going to take this plea. So he does take the Alford plea. He gets, I believe, 87 months in prison. But because he had served 8 years, which I think was like 96 months, he gets credited for his time served, and ultimately he gets to go home. But the thing with an Alford plea is that you still become a convicted felon. So he is technically convicted of voluntary manslaughter. That will be on his record forever. Granted, the man is like 60-something years old, so at this point it is what it is, but he has to live with that stain. And you could tell that while they were going through this process, he was very, very conflicted about taking the Alford plea because he was like, I didn't kill her. I loved my wife. We had a very, very happy marriage. I will not say that I am guilty of doing this. And he said that specifically, that he will take the plea, but he will never get up and say, I am guilty of killing my wife, because it wasn't true. And by this point, this was episode 13, this was like 13 hours later, I was convinced that he didn't kill his wife. That's how I felt, because personally, the prosecution didn't show me any kind of evidence that made it clear in any way that he had killed his wife. There was that blood analysis evidence, as we clearly found out, was faked because that Dwayne Diva SBI analyst was just making shit up. So we know that there was no blood evidence that aligned with him killing his wife. The whole question about what happened in Germany, I didn't think that was relevant to the case at all whatsoever. And his sexual orientation had nothing to do with the case at all. That was completely irrelevant. And for the prosecution to make that the motive for him killing his wife just didn't make any sense to me. Was her death suspicious? I will admit that, because the amount of blood, the amount of lacerations that she had from having a fall down the stairs, it did seem suspicious. So I could understand why police and the prosecution thought that he killed her wife. But I feel like once you dug a little bit deeper, there was no evidence to support that. So it was kind of like, could you just let this man live? Let him grieve, let him move on with his life. At the end, we see that, you know, Kathleen's sisters and her daughter still believe that he killed Kathleen, and they are just livid, and they pretty much still feel like he should be rotting in jail for her murder. But they're entitled to feel how they feel. They lost a loved one. I feel for them as well. This was an unfortunate situation for the entire family, because it seemed like they were a very happy, healthy family prior to this, and now it's like very shattered, very broken. And there was this really sweet part at the end where you could hear Mike talking to his two daughters, his two adopted daughters, and saying, you know, perhaps there's a chance for you and your sister, i.e. Kathleen's daughter, to like get back together. And the daughters are like, I am at a place in my life where I don't want that to happen. But you could see he wants his family to be whole again. He wants his family to be together. And I just thought that that was so sweet. To have to sit through like 8 years of prison, knowing that your wife's daughter hates you, thinks that you murdered her, and then to come out and be like, I want her to have a relationship with her sisters, is just like so heartwarming that he was able to remain so positive after all of that. At the end of the series, we actually get an interview with the judge who has presided over this case for the entire 15 years. And what I thought was really interesting is that the judge kind of admitted like pieces of like fault in some way without really admitting it. Like, he said that had this case gone to trial, he would not have allowed the information from Germany in, and he would not have allowed the information about Mike's sexual orientation to be a part of the case. He just felt like that was not relevant. Even though he did allow it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he said that in a new case, he would not have allowed that to be entered into evidence or, you know, brought up during the trial, basically. And then he says at the end that had this case gone to trial now, he thinks that a jury would have had reasonable doubt. And it almost seemed like he felt sad that Mike chose to forego a trial for the Alford plea. It almost felt like he wanted Mike to go through a second trial so he could get the verdict of not guilty and not have the stain of having that conviction on his record. It really did feel like he was like, damn, I really wish that, without him saying these exact words, what I heard was that I wish he went through this trial because I don't think he would have been found guilty, and I as a judge would have handled it differently. And I think that the jury would have had reasonable doubt. That's what I heard when he said it. And that was quite interesting as well. In the end, I feel like this was such an interesting case of how flawed the American justice system is. You know, he did everything right. Like, we oftentimes talk about Black people and their experiences in the American justice system, but this system is bad for everybody. Like, this man spent 8 years of his life in prison for a crime that I personally don't think that he did. And I think that he did everything right. He got the good defense lawyer. He paid for the defense lawyer. He, you know, was forthcoming with police. He put himself and his life out there. And we got to see all of this recorded in a way that we never really see before. And at the end of the day, the system still failed him. And, you know, it's for reasons like this that I'm always like just very wary. And I remember saying to like my fiance while we were watching it, I wish you would get so drunk and fall on the stairs and die, and now I have to be in prison for 10 years because you were stupid and you couldn't hold your liquor and you couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without falling down. Like, I would be livid. And he's so gracious in this series because, you know, he's still crying and mourning for his wife because he never really got a chance to do that. Me, on the other hand, I'd be mad as hell. Like, you go really put me through that? Like, it's sad to think that what essentially was an accident, like just an honest accident, she got drunk, she fell down the stairs, she died, turned into this. This was a hard one to watch. And this is why I recommend that you don't watch this in a full sitting, because at the end of the day, there were no happy endings. He lost 10 years of his life. His health is clearly not great. He's not doing well. He's no longer at the level of affluence that he was prior to this. Like, this man's life, I don't want to say it's ruined, because he still has his life, he still has his family, and that is the most important thing to him. But he even says, like, at the end of it, is that he has no faith in this system. Like, he put his hands in this system. He was not willing to go through another trial because the first trial screwed him over. He has no faith that the system would do right by him because for 15 years it didn't do right by him. And while he's out and he's free now because he served his time, it's still sad watching this because there were no happy endings. You know, a woman died and a family got broken up and there's no real resolution. Anyways, I'm sorry this was so depressing. I did not mean for this to be a depressing episode, but this one, it was hard for me to stomach, and it was hard for me to sit through it, but I thought that this was an extremely fascinating case because we had all of this raw footage of over the years that you just don't really see ever. Anyways, I hope you guys are liking this series. If you are liking my little makeup murder series, please leave a comment down below. I'm not sure how I will keep doing this, if I will keep doing this. But if you guys like it, let me know. Because I do watch and listen to a number of true crime podcasts and documentaries. So I'm always enveloped in true crime and I like talking about it. But if you all don't want to hear about it, I'll have to find another outlet. So let me know down below how you're liking this series. As always, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already done so. Like I said, leave a comment, share with a friend if you think they'll like the content. And as always, thank you all so very much for watching. I'll catch you in my next one. Bye!